I want to tell you about a night in August 1944 when a German general made a bet with 175 tanks. He lost, and the way he lost changed warfare permanently. But to understand why, you need to sit with me for a while. Because the real story here isn't about the tanks that burned. It's about why the men inside them never had a chance. The night of August 6, 1944. The hills around the small Norman town of Mortain. In a field command post lit by a single oil lamp, General of Panzer Troops Hans Eberbach stood over a map spread across a wooden table. Eberbach was not a dreamer. He was a professional, a man who had spent his entire career studying how to move large masses of steel across a battlefield. He was good at it, arguably one of the best the Germans had, and tonight he was holding an order that he personally considered a final gamble. The codename was Operation Lüttich. The objective was straightforward enough to fit on a postcard: cut the American army in half. Under direct orders from Hitler, Eberbach had assembled what was probably the most formidable strike force the Germans had concentrated since D-Day. 4 armored divisions, the 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, the 2nd SS Panzer Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer, and the 116th Panzer. Somewhere between 175 and 185 operational tanks ready to move. Now I want to be specific about what those tanks were. Because it matters. These were not average machines. The Panther weighed 45 tons and could kill anything the Americans had at ranges the Americans couldn't answer. The Panzer IV was a veteran, proven across 100 engagements. And then there were the Tigers. 60 tons of steel. An 88mm gun that could punch through anything the Allies fielded. And frontal armor that shrugged off most Allied anti-tank rounds like rain off a roof. Eberbach's plan relied on surprise. He would attack at midnight without preliminary artillery fire to preserve secrecy. His armored columns would drive straight west toward the coast at Avranches. 30 kilometers. That's all he needed. 30 kilometers, and he would sever Patton's Third Army from its supply line and potentially reverse the entire Allied position in Normandy. He believed in the power of concentrated armor. He believed that in darkness and early morning fog his tanks were effectively invincible. The American defenders around Mortain, mainly the 30th Infantry Division, were stretched thin and tired. A concentrated steel fist driven into a weak point would shatter them. But there was one factor that worried him. The weather officers from the Luftwaffe had reported that tomorrow, August 7th, would be clear, bright sunshine, not a cloud in the sky. For a farmer, that's good news. For a German tank commander in 1944, that was something else entirely. Eberbach had been promised 300 Luftwaffe fighters to cover his advance. He was skeptical about that promise. But he had no choice except to trust it. As midnight approached and the Maybach engines began rumbling to life across the assembly areas, Eberbach watched his columns move into the darkness. He felt the old confidence that comes with massed armor. Nothing on the ground could stop this. He was sure of it. Here's the thing though. Eberbach was preparing to fight the war of 1940. He was about to discover that the war had moved on without him. You're listening to Classified Dossiers on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast. New episodes are released daily at 11 a.m. Hit subscribe and leave a like. It helps these stories reach more people who care about getting history right. Now, before we get to what happened when the sun came up, I want to spend a few minutes on something that doesn't get discussed enough. I want to talk about why Eberbach, a smart, experienced, professional officer, walked into this with such confidence. Because he wasn't stupid. He was operating inside a mental framework that had been validated by 4 years of spectacular success. And that framework had a blind spot big enough to drive a Typhoon through. Since the opening days of Blitzkrieg, the image of German panzer columns rolling forward in unstoppable waves had become the defining symbol of modern warfare. The Germans had built their entire military doctrine around the concept of Schwerpunkt, the concentrated armored thrust. Mass your tanks at a single narrow point. Smash through the defensive line with brute mechanical force. Then pour into the rear areas to create chaos. And technically speaking, their machines were superb. A Tiger could engage and destroy enemy armor at 2,000 meters while incoming rounds bounced off its frontal plate like pebbles off a castle wall. German tank crews were trained to believe they were invincible knights riding inside mobile fortresses. Eberbach was a product of that belief system. He had seen it work in Poland. He had seen it work in France. He had seen it work in Russia. As long as his tanks were moving, he believed nothing could stop them. But here's the blind spot. The German military mind was fixated on the two-dimensional battle, the fight on the ground. They consistently underestimated the third dimension, the sky. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had owned that sky. German tanks moved freely in daylight, concentrated in large formations without fear of air attack. This created a dangerous habit. German armor commanders gradually came to treat friendly air superiority as a background condition, something that was simply there. Like gravity. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. Eberbach knew this intellectually, but he underestimated what Allied tactical air power had become. He thought of aircraft as things that bombed bridges and railway stations, fixed targets. Strategic targets. He did not seriously believe that a small airplane could reliably kill a moving heavy tank. Think about his reasoning for a moment, because it made sense based on everything he knew. A free-falling bomb hitting a tank zigzagging at speed? The probability was extremely low. The machine guns mounted on top of his tanks should be enough to discourage the buzzing flies overhead. What Eberbach did not know, what he could not have known without intelligence he never received, was that the British had changed the rules. They were no longer dropping free-fall bombs on tanks. They had developed something purpose-built for killing armor. The RP-3 rocket. At RAF tactical airfields across Normandy, ground crews were bolting metal rails beneath the wings of Hawker Typhoons. Each aircraft carried 8 RP-3 rockets. Each rocket carried a 60-pound warhead, roughly 27 kilograms of high explosive. This was not a kinetic penetrator that needed velocity to punch through armor plate. This was a flying block of explosive. When it struck a target, it didn't need to penetrate. The blast effect of 27 kilograms of heat was sufficient to shear tank tracks, blow turrets off their rings, or simply kill the crew inside through concussive overpressure without leaving a mark on the exterior hull. The Germans thought of a tank as a fortress. The British thought of a tank as a metal box full of gasoline and ammunition that just needed a big enough spark to destroy itself. Eberbach was preparing for a classic tank duel, Panthers trading shots with Shermans across open fields. He was not prepared to be attacked from 45 degrees above by objects moving faster than sound. And there was one more thing he didn't know. Thanks to Ultra, the Allies had read his entire operational order before his own tank crews had. I want to stay on this point about Ultra for a moment because it's crucial to understanding what happened next. The Allied response to Eberbach's attack was not a reaction. It was a prepared position. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted and decrypted Hitler's attack order within hours of its transmission through the Enigma system. Montgomery and Bradley didn't need to guess what Eberbach was planning. They had read his script before he stepped on stage. Now here's what's interesting about how the Allies chose to respond. They could have rushed tank divisions forward to block the German advance. That would have been the conventional answer: meet armor with armor. Fight steel with steel. It would have worked, probably, but it would have been expensive in lives and equipment. Instead, they made a different choice. A choice that tells you everything about how the Western Allies had come to think about warfare by the summer of 1944. They decided to use air power as their primary killing instrument. At the headquarters of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham issued an order that was unprecedented in its scope. Every Typhoon fighter-bomber squadron in the sector was to cancel all other missions. The entire weight of tactical air power would be concentrated on a single target set, the German tank columns at Mortain. Now I need to tell you about the system the British had built. Because the system mattered more than any individual aircraft, they called it cab rank. The name is perfect because it describes exactly how it worked. Instead of waiting on the ground for a call and then taking off, which introduces a delay of 30 to 40 minutes minimum, Typhoon squadrons flew continuous holding patterns over the battle area, circling like taxis waiting for a fare. The moment a forward observer on the ground spotted German armor, he radioed directly to the aircraft overhead. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, the Typhoons were rolling into their attack dives. The cab rank system eliminated response time almost entirely. It transformed air power from a distant supporting arm into something more like airborne artillery hovering directly above the enemy's head. Available on demand, instantly, and sustaining this system required an industrial effort that's easy to overlook. Dozens of forward airstrips had been built close to the front lines. Thousands of ground crew worked continuous shifts refueling and rearming. A Typhoon could return from a strike, rearm with a fresh load of 8 rockets, refuel, and be airborne again in roughly 20 minutes. Let me put the mathematics of this in plain terms, because the numbers are what make it terrifying. Eberbach had 175 tanks. The Allies had over 500 Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts available, each capable of flying 3 to 4 sorties per day. That meant each German tank would face an average of 10 air attacks over the course of a single day. This was not a battle. This was an industrial process, a disassembly line running in reverse. And while Eberbach was counting on 300 promised Luftwaffe fighters to keep the sky clear, the reality was already determined. German airfields had been bombed into craters. The handful of fighters that managed to get airborne were intercepted and shot down before they reached Mortain. The sky on August 7th belonged entirely and exclusively to the Allies. The British and Americans intended to make an example of what happens when a ground army operates without air cover in 1944. Eberbach's 175 tanks were about to become the demonstration model. Dawn, August 7, 1944. The sun climbed slowly behind the Norman hills and burned away the fog that had covered the valley through the night. The sky turned from gray to a hard clean blue. Not a cloud anywhere. At his forward command post, Eberbach received the first reports, and they were encouraging. His armored spearheads had made good progress in the darkness. They had taken Mortain and were pushing west. The tank columns were moving openly along the main roads. Confident, unhurried, not bothering with camouflage. They were racing the clock to reach the coast before the weather cleared. Eberbach looked up at the empty sky and waited for the sound of German engines. He waited for the Focke-Wulf 190s with black crosses on their wings. The fighter cover that had been promised by the High Command. The sky stayed empty. Then a different sound reached him. A low, angry droning, like a swarm of very large and very unhappy hornets. From the north, black dots appeared on the horizon. A few at first, then more, rapidly resolving into the distinctive blunt-jawed silhouettes that every German soldier in Normandy had learned to fear. Typhoons. Now I want you to understand how the trap worked on the ground. Because the geography was part of the killing mechanism. The German columns were strung out along narrow roads with dense hedgerows on both sides. They could not disperse into the fields because the terrain was too broken and too soft for heavy vehicles. They were locked onto the tarmac in long single-file columns. On the hilltops overlooking the valley, American forward observers were already in position with binoculars and radios. They didn't need to fire a single shot. They just needed to read grid coordinates. Enemy armor moving on road N177. Grid reference XY. Request immediate air support. The information went directly to the Typhoon squadrons circling overhead. The aircraft peeled off from their holding patterns, rolled onto their backs, and began their attack dives. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical precision of a factory process. The first flight of 4 Typhoons targeted a column of 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich vehicles jammed at a road junction. The lead aircraft released its first pair of rockets. 2 white smoke trails streaked across the sky and slammed into the lead Panther. The explosion was not the deep rumble of a heavy shell. It was a sharp tearing crack, the sound of 27 kilograms of high explosive detonating against the engine deck of a 45-ton tank. The Panther shuddered violently. The engine covers blew off. Fire erupted instantly, dense and furious. The crew never got out. The burning tank became an immovable roadblock, sealing the entire column behind it in place. And that was when, as one British pilot later put it, the shooting gallery opened for business. More Typhoons poured in. They didn't need to aim carefully. The targets were too densely packed to miss. A Tiger took a rocket hit on its track. The blast sheared the track links apart and the 60-ton machine slewed sideways across the road, its gun barrel dipping toward the ground in a gesture that looked almost like surrender. A Hanomag half-track carrying infantry took a direct hit and simply came apart, the pieces and the men inside scattered across the hedgerow like a dropped box of spare parts. Eberbach stood at his command post gripping his binoculars so tightly his knuckles went white. He could see the black smoke columns rising from the valley, one after another, merging into a wall of smoke that obscured the horizon. Through the radio he could hear his tank commanders, brave men who had never retreated from any enemy on the ground, begging for help. Begging for the Luftwaffe to appear. Begging for anti-aircraft fire. But there was nothing to give them. Only the sound of rockets and the noise of steel being torn apart. For the next 7 hours the valley of Mortain became a killing floor. I want to walk you through what that looked like at the level of individual machines and individual men. Because the aggregate numbers, 150 tanks destroyed, thousands of casualties, don't convey what actually happened in those hours. The destruction followed a pattern that repeated itself dozens of times across the battlefield with the regularity of an industrial shift. Let me describe one sequence that was documented in detail by British after-action reports, because it illustrates how the system worked at the point of contact. A Tiger II, the most powerful tank Germany ever built, 70 tons of armor plate and an 88mm gun that could kill anything on Earth at 2 kilometers, was engaged simultaneously by 3 Typhoons. The first rocket missed, detonating on the ground a few meters from the hull. It didn't matter. The blast overpressure from 27 kilograms of heat exploding at close range destroyed the tank's external optics, periscopes, vision blocks, rangefinder. The crew inside was instantly blind. The second rocket struck the turret. It did not penetrate the 150mm frontal armor. But here's something that the German designers had not adequately considered. You don't need to punch through armor to kill the men behind it. The concussive shock of that much explosive detonating against a steel surface transmits directly through the metal into the fighting compartment. The loader died immediately from cerebral hemorrhage. The commander was thrown against the turret wall and broke his neck. The tank was externally intact. Inside it was a tomb. The third rocket hit the engine deck. The fuel ignited. Fire was drawn into the crew compartment through the ventilation system. The Tiger became a high-pressure furnace. That sequence, blind them, stun them, burn them, played out across the entire battlefield with minor variations. Ammunition trucks detonated in chain reactions, incinerating tanks that had pulled alongside for cover. Infantry who had dismounted to take shelter in ditches were caught by 20mm cannon fire from aircraft making strafing passes along the length of the columns. But what struck me most when I read the accounts, and I want to be honest with you about this, was not the physical destruction. It was the psychological collapse. These were elite German tank crews. Men who had fought on the Eastern Front. Men who had faced Soviet T-34s at point-blank range without flinching. Men who defined themselves by their courage under fire. And they broke. They broke because this was not combat as they understood it. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see. You cannot shoot back at something moving at 600 kilometers per hour. You cannot take cover inside an armored vehicle when the weapon being used against you was specifically designed to turn armored vehicles into ovens. Many crews abandoned undamaged tanks and fled into the woods on foot. They chose the risk of a court-martial over the certainty of sitting inside a steel box waiting to be cooked alive. That tells you something about the intensity of what they experienced that no casualty figure can communicate. By 4 in the afternoon, organized German resistance had effectively ceased. The armored column that had rolled out with such confidence 12 hours earlier was now a miles-long chain of burning wreckage. The smoke was thick enough and the smell, diesel fuel, cordite, burning rubber, burning flesh, was strong enough that pilots flying at low altitude reported they could smell the battlefield from their cockpits. By 7 in the evening, the last Typhoons turned for home. The engine noise faded and a silence settled over the Mortain Valley, but it was the wrong kind of silence. Not peace, absence. Eberbach walked the road that night. I think it's important to stay with him for a moment here, because what he saw in the moonlight deserves to be recorded plainly, without drama, because the reality needs no embellishment. Hundreds of burned-out steel carcasses blocked the road in both directions. The Tigers that had been the pride of German engineering that morning were now blackened skeletons, their gun barrels drooping toward the earth. Tank tracks lay scattered dozens of meters from their vehicles like severed limbs. Turrets that weighed 12 tons had been blown completely off their hull rings and sat upside down in the hedgerows. He passed a Panther and saw a charred hand reaching out from the commander's hatch. The fingers curled as if trying to hold onto something in the last moment. A group of surviving tank crewmen sat in the dirt nearby, faces black with soot, eyes focused on nothing. They didn't salute him. They didn't have the energy left to salute. According to the consolidated after-action reports, the Germans lost more than 150 tanks and self-propelled guns along with hundreds of trucks and armored vehicles. Roughly 30 tanks remained nominally operational, but most of those were damaged. Personnel casualties ran into the thousands. But I want to point you toward one number in particular, because it tells the story of Mortain more efficiently than anything else I can say. During the entire day of fighting, German anti-aircraft fire managed to shoot down exactly 3 Typhoons. 3. Let that ratio settle in your mind for a moment. 3 inexpensive aircraft traded for 150 of the most sophisticated and expensive armored vehicles on Earth. Each of those tanks represented thousands of man-hours of precision engineering, months of factory production time, irreplaceable skilled labor, and critical raw materials that Germany could no longer source. Each Typhoon represented a few days of assembly line work. Each RP-3 rocket cost a fraction of what it cost to manufacture a single tank track link. This was the mathematics that Eberbach was confronting as he walked through the wreckage. He had tried to fight with honor, with skill, with the accumulated expertise of a professional lifetime. His opponent had fought with arithmetic and industrial capacity. They had used cheap mass-produced consumables to destroy expensive, irreplaceable capital assets. It was the same logic that a factory owner uses when he calculates that it's cheaper to replace a worn machine than to repair it, except applied to warfare, with human lives factored into the equation as production costs. Eberbach saw a young officer kneeling beside a dead comrade, weeping. The sound carried through the night air, raw, desolate, the sound of something ending. Not just a battle, a belief system. The belief that superior machinery and superior training and superior courage would always prevail. That belief died at Mortain alongside the tanks. It died because courage is not a variable in an equation where one side controls the sky and the other side does not. You can be the bravest man in the world inside a Tiger tank. It does not matter if the weapon killing you costs less than your wristwatch and arrives from an angle your armor was never designed to protect against. Eberbach turned his back on the battlefield and walked toward his command post. He knew the Typhoons would return at dawn. He knew he had no way to protect his surviving men from what was coming. He had commanded one of the most powerful armored formations in Western Europe. Now he was powerless, and I think that's the word that matters most in this story. Not destroyed, not defeated, powerless. Because there's a difference between losing a fight and discovering that the fight you prepared for no longer exists. Eberbach had prepared for a tank battle. What he got was an industrial process conducted from an altitude he couldn't reach with any weapon he possessed. After Mortain, the German army never again attempted a large-scale daylight armored concentration on the Western Front. They moved at night, in small groups, under tree cover, like fugitives. The psychological confidence that had carried German panzer divisions from Warsaw to Moscow and back, the belief that massed armor was the decisive instrument of modern war, was broken at Mortain and it never recovered. Now I want to step back and say something about what I think Mortain actually means. Because I've been thinking about this for a while and I'm not sure the standard interpretation goes deep enough. The usual lesson drawn from Mortain is that air power defeated armor. And that's true as far as it goes. But I think the deeper lesson is about the nature of military advantage itself and how quickly it can reverse. For 4 years German tank crews had operated inside a framework where their skills, their training, and the quality of their machines translated directly into battlefield dominance. They were the best at what they did, and what they did was the thing that mattered most. Mortain was the moment when what they did stopped being the thing that mattered most. Not because they got worse at it. They were as skilled on August 7th as they had been on August 6th. The Panther was as well engineered on the day it burned as on the day it rolled off the production line. What changed was the environment. The British didn't beat the German tanks by building better tanks. They beat them by making tanks irrelevant, by shifting the competition to a domain where German excellence couldn't follow. That's a pattern that shows up again and again in military history. And frankly in every other kind of competitive endeavor. The dominant player optimizes for the current game. The challenger changes the game. And the dominant player, precisely because he's invested so heavily in mastering the old rules, is the last one to recognize that the rules have changed. Eberbach was one of the finest practitioners of armored warfare who ever lived. At Mortain that expertise was worth exactly nothing, because the contest had moved to a dimension where his expertise didn't apply. I find that worth sitting with quietly for a moment, not because I want to diminish what those German tank crews experienced. Their suffering was real and it was terrible, but because the principle underneath the suffering is one that outlives any particular war. The advantage that feels most permanent is often the most fragile. The strength you're most proud of is frequently the one that blinds you to the threat you can't see coming. Hans Eberbach couldn't see the threat because it came from above, from an angle his armor wasn't designed to cover, delivered by weapons that cost less than the fuel in his tanks. 175 of the finest armored vehicles ever built. Destroyed in 7 hours, by rockets that cost a fraction of a tank track link. That's not a battle. That's a lesson, and the classroom was the sky over Mortain. Thank you for listening to this dossier on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast. If this account of Operation Lüttich gave you something to think about, not just about 1944 but about how advantage works and how it disappears, we'd be grateful for a subscribe and a like. We try to tell these stories honestly, from every side of the wire. Because the truth of war is always more complicated and more human than the textbook version. Drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from. We'll see you in the next one.